So let us look at the relationship between an experience of trauma and the existence of the ego or identity. Both are common human experiences. Both involve another experience of something which is widely misunderstood, karma. We're going to look at the Kultura approach to trauma. Let's start with a meme, an image, something you can focus on. Let's take the creative law meme. Creative law is one of the universal principles of Kultura methodology. Creative law is a condensed reinterpretation of natural law. Therefore, we're dealing with the relationship between trauma, karma, and reincarnation. We are dealing with the interface between life and death. The principle behind creative law is simple. All existence is change. All existence is relationship. Please understand that the universe, this planet and nature all work on the same dynamic, and that is fragmentation and reflection. This is the important part, so while we are unpacking everything here, let's start with this. Fragmentation and reflection. Trauma is force. The force in question can be sudden and violent, or it can be gradual and subtle, but it's still force. Examples of trauma include death, bereavement, injury, sickness, disease, anything which creates impact and which disrupts karma. Then you have karma, which is action. Karma is action, reaction and interaction. Both trauma and karma are physical in nature, based on energy and relationship, and being based on energy, both are defined by the wavelength, cycle or wave, and frequency of energy. Trauma increases the energy frequency and shortens the cycle. Karma decreases the energy frequency and lengthens the wave or cycle. Understand here that the universe, this planet and nature are all predicated entirely upon equilibrium, homeostasis, harmony, balance, cohesion and flow. Trauma destroys all these things and creates chaos and disorder. Karma is what happens to return to equilibrium and balance, cohesion and flow. Let's use a couple of examples to see how this works. Say you have a bell and a hammer. You hit the bell with a hammer. The impact of the hammer hitting the bell is trauma, because you have impact. Out of trauma you get karma. When you hit the bell with the hammer, the bell will ring. The bell will continue ringing until the frequency of the sound waves fades into silence, at which you have equilibrium. Each time you hit the bell with the hammer you will get ringing and then silence. The order never changes. First trauma, then karma, and then equilibrium. See if you can recognize the same principle with the next example. You have a pool of water and you have a stone. The surface of the water is smooth. You drop the stone into the water. The impact of the stone hitting the surface of the water creates a splash. Once again we have impact and trauma. Immediately after the splash you get waves and ripples. The waves and the ripples on the surface of the water is karma. However, eventually the waves become ripples as the frequency of the energy decreases, until the surface of the water is smooth again, which is equilibrium. Trauma always creates a new karmic process. This never changes. The variable here is scale and dimension. Dropping a boulder into a body of water will create a bigger splash than a pebble. A bigger hammer or a bigger bell will produce a louder ring. The karmic process will be longer. If you stub your toe on a hard surface, say a furniture leg, sure you will swear and dance around in circles for a few minutes. But if you fall off a ladder and break your leg, the impact from the trauma will be much greater, and the karmic process of healing will be much longer. If you were traumatized repeatedly from an abusive childhood and experienced mental trauma, your karmic process of healing can last many years. Scale and dimension. So to properly understand fragmentation and reflection, we also need to understand the difference between animate and inanimate. If you drop a ceramic mug or plate on a hard floor surface, it will break and fragment. As the plate or mug is inanimate, and is not living, the mug or plate will not pick itself back up off the floor and start putting itself together. It simply stays broken and remains on the floor until you sweep it up. You cannot heal a broken mug or plate, because it is not living. It remains broken ceramic pieces. But you are living. You are animate. You are part of the unfolding relationship between reality, existence, and being. Being is dependent on existence, with existence arising out of reality. You are the universe and the universe is you. This is just as true as you are the world and the world is you. You are a manifestation of existence and nature, in human form. The universe and the world is what is happening through you. Therefore, while you are a fragment of the universe, the world and nature, your life is a reflection of what is happening in the universe, this planet and nature. This is how to understand the principle of reflection and fragmentation. So we come back to trauma as an experience. What trauma is, when you stop and think about it, is a manifestation of reality forcing change on your being. It really makes no difference where the source of the trauma is. It could be an accident. You could be traumatized by someone else's treatment, abuse, or ignorance towards you. It could be something you've done to yourself. But whatever the source of the actual trauma is, it's still reality forcing change on your being. Trauma is multidimensional, so the change that is being forced will manifest across different levels of reality and planes of consciousness. You experience impact and shock out of the realization. Part of this impact and shock brings new conscious awareness, new mental and emotional trauma, and some physical trauma which manifests in your body. It is not uncommon, say for example if your trauma is bereavement and grief, someone you loved has died, or you have lost a beloved pet, that you experience physical symptoms such as pain, such as lethargy, such as numbness. It is out of this impact and fragmentation caused by the trauma, through which you experience realization, that you get the dramatic unfolding of a new karmic process. Your perception of reality has changed. Your conscious awareness has changed. So inevitably there has to be a new unfolding karmic process as a direct response to the trauma. So let's move on to another illustration. We have different levels of being, which it is thought to correspond to planes of existence and levels of reality. There are different ways of looking at this. But it is believed that for every level of being there are different planes of existence and levels of reality. As life is all about relationship, you make connections with others and your environment on different levels of reality. Now, moving on to another illustration, there are 5 dimensions of living existence. If you remember previously, I stated that there is a difference between animate and inanimate. Basic reality is assumed to be 3-dimensional, which means reality exists in the present moment within the 3 physical dimensions. But we can add a 4th dimension of time to talk about past reality and future reality. Please keep in mind here that there are 2 basic versions of reality. There is actual reality, such as a tree, your physical body, your brain, this planet, the universe. Then you have cultural or conceptual reality, which manifests out of human thinking, human imagination, and human belief. So when you think about or talk about reality, it's important to differentiate between actual reality and conceptual or cultural reality. Actual reality is really real, and conceptual reality is only relatively real. Then you have the 5th dimension, which is spirit. So let's move on to the ego. Your ego is your identity and a conceptual belief of yourself you started developing in childhood and you keep developing through your life. You develop it through a process of social conditioning which you are subjected to pretty much from infancy, through upbringing, education, and so on. It's your central most important belief system. It's generally what you refer to whenever you use I or me in a sentence. The ego is your strongest psychological and emotional attachment. This is something I want to make very clear. Some spiritual teachers will tell you that you must get rid of your ego in order to be free. But you cannot get rid of something that you're constantly using and reinforcing through talking about yourself and using those I and me statements. The ego is the basis of the self-centered me. The existence of the ego is not the issue in itself. The issue is believing that your ego is all you are and that it is as real as everything else. This is the real issue. This becomes a major issue after an experience of trauma. The major issue is that trauma is forcing change through a new karmic process, and the ego is a belief attachment. It's back to that difference between animate and inanimate. The ego is inanimate, because it's based on thought. Beliefs are inanimate. They're not living. But if you are centered on your ego and believe that's all you are, then you're going to be resistant to whatever change is being forced on you through trauma. Thought is based on the polarity between desire and fear, and being dependent on time seeks permanence and continuity. How you respond to this internal conflict depends on who you are, how you were socially conditioned, and the nature of the trauma you've experienced. If desire predominates over fear, you may go into a state of denial. If fear predominates over desire, then you may develop anxiety, a loss of self-esteem, self-confidence, or you may reach out for a substance to change your mental state and block out the memory of the trauma. Another common issue is rumination. After a traumatic experience, if you're centered on your ego, is that you will keep going back to the traumatic experience over and over and over again. Please understand that the ego being identity is a belief attachment. Example: if someone insults you or offends you, or verbally attacks you, during the day, then it won't matter what else happens on that day, because you will be fixated on that one negative interaction with someone else. This is where trauma becomes suffering, and the ego loves suffering, simply because the suffering is what maintains the ego. This is the key aspect between trauma and karma on the one hand and ego on the other. Suffering is when the ego is winning the conflict over trauma, karma and the rest of your being. It doesn't matter here if you are the victim or the survivor, it's still suffering or memory of suffering. You will still keep on dragging up the past and projecting the past trauma into your mind. Here is where I want to point out a major point. People tell you that you need to let go and move on, but this is a mistake. Trauma is real. Karma is real. The ego isn't as real as trauma and karma. Trauma and karma are actualities. The ego is just a social construct. Yet it is a belief attachment and is not in the business of letting go. Telling someone struggling with bereavement and grief to just move on is about as insensitive you can get. But there is something else which arises out of the rumination which creates the suffering. Some methods of inquiry and spiritual beliefs will tell you that it is the clinging to desire which causes the suffering and which is the attachment. But the attachment here is to the ego, not the trauma or resulting karma. It's the ego which is telling you that this is your trauma, your suffering, your karma. It's something which happened to me, the self-centered me, the center of the ego. This is how you become attached to the suffering, because it is the suffering which provides the continuity required by thought and thinking. So you end up in a vicious circle. You want to end the suffering, but you're attached to your ego, and it's the attachment to ego which is perpetuating the suffering. It's quite the predicament, because the more you think about the past trauma, the more you reinforce the suffering, because the suffering provides the continuity back to the ego. But see, it's the attachment to the suffering which reinforces the ego, which distorts your perspective and your perception of self and other. By the time you have personalized the past trauma into suffering, you are creating unnecessary emotional and psychological baggage you carry with you through life. It destroys the trust between self and others, so you end up not trusting others and also not trusting yourself. This is why people end up stuck in abusive relationships. They cannot see or recognize the abuse because they're attached to their own suffering and it's a part of their identity and ego. This is also what locks people into addiction to various substances, because they don't see the abuse or harm they're doing to themselves, because their focus is on suffering and the continuity of ego. It's this distortion of perspective and the suffering in mind which creates further suffering in relationships. The other thing to point out here is that you cannot liberate someone from their suffering. You can point out the abuse, the attachment to past trauma, but you're doing this from your own perspective because you don't have the perspective of the person who is suffering. They will see it as an attack on their ego or emotional attachments, and are more likely to double down. Being centered on your ego is always self-limiting because your focus of conscious attention becomes limited to the psychological and intellectual plane of consciousness. So you end up on a somewhat linear journey of healing and recovery, which generally involves journaling, therapy, counseling, various methods, yoga, meditation, and so on. On a superficial, this is helpful. You feel a little less raw and vulnerable, a bit more functional, maybe there's also some stability. But you're still clinging to and reinforcing the same self-centered me. It's still all I am the one who is hurting, I am the one who is broken. I am the one who must heal. I am the one who must recover. I am the one who must carry the burden of this story. The uncomfortable truth here is that through all of this you are giving your ego, the fixed belief system and image of you, the continuity it needs to continue. Because you're doing this, you end up stuck on one level of reality and in one plane of consciousness. This is what gets you trapped in the illusion of becoming. I am the victim. I am the survivor. I am self-healing. I am doing the spiritual work. I am recovering. Notice that throughout all these changes there is still the I and the self-centered me at the root of it all. This is the illusion of self-improvement and of working on yourself. But the central question is, who or what are you working on? The answer is, of course, your ego. The identity changes, the story changes, but the assumption is the same. I am the ego. I am the self-centered me. I am nothing more than the self-centered me and the ego. So the deeper impact of the trauma, on the other deeper levels of reality and more refined planes of consciousness, never gets examined or explored. This is simply because it lies beyond the narrow focus of attention and the ego. So what generally happens in this situation is that the trauma gets repeated over and over again. This is basic reincarnation. After the alcohol addiction you've quit and are counting the days you are sober, but you fall off the wagon. You're free from the abusive relationship, yet you either go back or enter into another abusive relationship. This is how people get caught up in lifelong dysfunctional relationship cycles. They go from one dysfunctional relationship to another, doing therapy in between. Or they end up being in a dysfunctional relationship and having to do therapy alongside being in the relationship. You think you're moving forward and making progress, but keep ending up stuck in the same place over and over again. All too often that future image of you never materializes. The drugs and alcohol of your past addiction remain a constant threat. You never manage to lose that sufficient amount of weight. You're unable to find that healthy relationship. You never really become that more desirable future image of you. These are just further attachments to images that you're clinging to just so you can continue clinging to the current or image of you, which is your ego. You're playing mind games on yourself. This is all that is happening. At some point you've got to take a step back and think about what you're doing to yourself. Let us be very, very clear here. Trauma is really real. Pain is really real. The effects of the alcohol on your physical body and spirit, as an example, are really real. The grief is really real, irrespective of whether it arises from the loss of a loved one through physical death or the loss of a significant relationship. The reality of whatever trauma you have experienced goes way beyond the narrow limitations of your ego and focus of attention. Your ego, based on thought and belief, is only relatively real. People will tell you to move on and move forward. You cannot move on from trauma. Trauma is the source and basis for your karmic flow. Trauma started the whole process of karma. So what does moving on and moving forward really mean? It basically means moving forward with your fixed self-image through ego. Understand that this is the illusion. This is literally the irresistible force, which is trauma, meeting the immovable object, which is the ego. Karma is not some divine reward and punishment system. Karma is memory and action or activity. Karma is action, reaction and interaction. You have a karmic process going on irrespective of how you identify or label yourself. But it's always better, seeing as you have a karmic process, is to have a karmic process that just simply flows with the most amount of cohesion. To have that cohesion and flow in your karmic process, and therefore your life, you need to have space. Water cannot flow from a closed container, it needs somewhere to flow towards. Think of a river, flowing to the sea. Consider if you put a dam on the river, the water builds up behind the dam. The exact same principle works with karma. If you are centered within your ego, and therefore your conditioned mind, then you will also be rooted in your separateness and invariably will experience division after division, conflict after conflict. This is simply because you're attached to your ego, various principles and belief systems. You will constantly be seeking emotional and psychological security, seeking permanence and continuity in everything, and you will buy into all the cultural illusions that come with all this. If you have experiences of past trauma, your healing journey will be punctuated by alternating experiences of progress and regression, recovery and failure, and you will end up going round and round in circles. The circles will be sometimes larger, sometimes smaller, but you're still going round and round in circles. The key thing to understand here is that your focus of attention, on which is the ego is based, is a focus. What I'm pointing out here is that it can be changed. You can focus more and be more specific, and you can focus less and be less specific. More focus brings you into your ego and thinking mind. Less focus brings you into your being, your conscious awareness, and your felt sense of immediate experience and senses. This shifting of focus in and out is the only real choice you can make in any situation. More focus means more ignorance and less conscious awareness. Less focus means more conscious awareness, more sense, and less ego and attachment. When you shift or lessen your focus of attention, you realize and become consciously aware that all there is the constant unfolding of reality, existence and being. There is no seeker, there is no someone doing, there is no journey, no path, there is just karma and the flow of life. This is what you're looking for, the flow of life and the flow of the karmic process. The key thing to understand here is that all this unfolding of reality, existence and being, through the karmic process, is happening all the time. This is all happening through you. You not only are the end product of this karmic process, you are the manifestation of the karmic process itself. In most cases, the ego is just the illusion that you are controlling all this. You're not. Not even close. It's all just happening through you. The karmic process started with the trauma. It didn't start with you. When you step out of your ego, shift the focus of your conscious attention outwards, and you stop trying to live up to your image, you start to make sense of what's happening to you. When you stop trying to cling to your image of ego, you can make sense. The mind games of moral reasoning and praise and blame stop making sense. It was never your fault. You were never to blame. Neither was anyone else. People were either more consciously aware or more ignorant. You are not broken. You simply changed as a result of the trauma. When you stop playing mind games with yourself and other people over your suffering, this is when you experience the awakening which helps you recover from the trauma. The answer doesn't lie in the therapy, the meditation, or the working on yourself. The answer lies in being centered and grounded in your sense, your humanity, and your empathy, first to yourself. This is when you complete the cycle. This is what's known as the circle of life.